Hey everyone, welcome back to More Flesh and Bad, and today I have a very exciting presentation for you. So we're going to be doing some Marlyn theory, and I've titled this presentation Carlynn theory because I kind of got into a conversation with someone, I think in the Purple Discord, that eventually ended in me kind of comparing Marlyn to a car. So like you know how cars have like different gears, they kind of start off like initially slow and they kind of like build up speed and kind of like this is basically going to be an extremely tortured kind of analogy to Initial D, which Tegan has been forcing me to watch recently, and is very cool. So we're going to basically reframe our kind of understanding of Marlyn from the point of view of a car. And my goal is to try and make this like actually kind of informative. This is like half a ship post and also half a real informative video about Marlyn. So I hope that this ends up being useful. But yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. So I wanted to start by saying that Marlyn is an 8-6. So for those of you who have not watched Initial D, Initial D is a show about basically a young man in his car, where basically the car I think is called like an 8-6 or whatever, and it's not like the best car, right? It's not like this crazy fast car or anything, but it is like very strong in the hands of a very skilled driver, basically. So everyone like underestimates our protagonist basically because he's driving like, oh, it's just like an old car or whatever. But the car is actually like very powerful. It just requires a very skilled pilot to or driver to kind of extract value. And I kind of think that Marlyn is like a very similar deck where you're doing a very, very powerful thing, but it isn't as innately powerful as like maybe some of the other decks in the format, like Marionette or Acilio. Like it's not doing a thing that is just busted and doesn't take a lot of skill necessarily to extract. But it is doing something that is very powerful in the hands of a pilot who has like a lot of reps. So that's kind of like how I think of Marlyn as well. So I kind of wanted to see if we can actually bring up the kind of skill level, I guess, of Marlyn pilots, especially in the community. So that's kind of like the goal of this video, basically. All right, so we're going to get into the meat of the presentation now. What is Carlynn theory? So in the show Initial D, there is this very nebulous concept called the theory of fastest driving, which is the English translation. I'm not sure actually what the other translations are. But basically, there's this character who just says he kind of has theories about like what the fastest driver can do and doesn't really expand on it super well. Like there's some fan theories or whatever. But Carlynn theory is kind of similar to that theory, where there's this nebulous idea that Marlyn's play patterns are very similar to kind of racing in Initial D, where maybe the best pilots or the fastest kind of drivers basically are doing something that basically the other pilots aren't doing. And I kind of wanted to kind of outline what that potentially might be. So I think racing in Initial D typically follows this kind of archetype where the main character's car basically like kind of starts off behind and then kind of tails the opponent for a while, just tries to kind of keep pace with the opponent. Then at some point, basically the car kind of starts like drifting or doing some kind of fancy techniques to basically overtake his opponent. And then he basically like finishes the race and lead and everyone cheers, right? So Marlyn's gameplay actually kind of follows a very similar play pattern, I think, to kind of like the archetype of a race in Initial D, where you're kind of starting the race behind. So you have like less armor, less like defensive resources than your opponent. So you have to kind of make up for that basically by keeping pace with your opponent and eventually like getting them through those resources and then kind of catching up. So this presentation is meant to be like a kind of theory on what Marlyn games kind of should look like, and also kind of teach you how to catch up to your opponent and like think creatively, basically, to hopefully try to win games. One additional note I did actually want to add here is that this is from the frame of reference of the specific kind of Marlyn build that basically me, Ben, Nate, and others have kind of pioneered over the course, where it's very buff heavy and like not running like stuff like Conquer the High Seas and stuff like that. We're kind of like, this is from the frame of reference of the Marlyn deck that I typically like will play on stream or whatever. So if you want to see more like live Marlyn action, go feel free to check out those videos or streams and stuff like that. But this is not for every Marlyn deck. This is for like the specific version of Marlyn that I think we all come to know and love. So the initial like kind of impetus for this conversation basically came from kind of complaints about the deck. So the main common complaints that I think I've heard is like, this hand just sends 8 overpower. I can never make any gold against warriors. The hands I draw are terrible. So I wanted to kind of address those comments because I think that's a very common complaint about the deck. It's like, oh, I'm not actually doing anything that's strong. It's just kind of like I'm setting these mid turns after mid turns. I'm never actually making any gold. I can never catch up. And I'm trying to actually hopefully teach you like how to actually like catch up in those games. because what a lot of people are describing is actually like fairly normal, I guess, in the course of a Marlin game, right? So the goal here is to kind of give you a few heuristics and guess play patterns to hopefully help improve your kind of driving or piloting of Marlin. And I wanted to give you a mental map on structure of a Marlin game. And this specific presentation is going to be from the frame of mind of basically armor heavy decks or more kind of mid-rangey matchups. So I'm talking about warriors, talking about like Jarl, basically any deck that's not like fatigue or not like an aggro race, basically anything like kind of in that mid-range kind of soup kind of realm is what I'm trying to basically talk about in this presentation. You can also actually see here from this Discord comment, it's a little bit hard to read, but basically we had one person in Purple Chat basically not understanding what the concept of like doing good math with Marlin looks like. So I wanted to kind of expand on that and kind of like outline how that works basically and like what sending good math basically means. So the first and most key element of an initial D race is starting the race behind. So as you can see in this kind of screenshot here, we have Takami's basically Terreno trailing behind another streetcar. So often in the show, basically, you'll start the race behind his opponent and basically have to figure out creative ways to basically pass his opponent on these like very dangerous curves on the side of a mountain, right? So Marlin's actually very similar to that, right? We're often starting the game comparatively weaker to other heroes. So we often have like a low armor amount and our opponent will maybe have a ton of armor. So like 8 to 10 armor. We'll often not start the game with any like gold or resources to actually work with, or if we do start the game with gold, it's with like Crown and Dominion. Like we'll normally start the game with like functionally 1 gold a lot of the time. And then most good Marlin builds can't really run defense reactions except as sideboard tech. So we're weaker defensively than most other decks. And historically, the reason why this is because they are often red and will brick you if you try to like crack gold for to dig for resources. So not having blue defense reactions means that the deck basically just like doesn't function right. So that's kind of the historical reason why you can't run defense reactions. You can maybe experiment with them, but like normally they're kind of bad. So as a result of having like low armor, low resources at the start of the game, and a low number of defensive tools, you'll often start the game by being out very behind your opponent, which is pretty normal. So like your opponent might end the turn at like 40 and you're at like 20. And this is like, I think, pretty common experience for a lot of Marlin pilots. And a lot of people think the deck is bad because they see that they're 20 points down in their opponent and they're like, oh, I can't catch up. This is like an impossible game to win. But it's actually not. That's like totally normal. All right, so we've kind of established that Marlin actually starts out behind in most of the races against our opponent. But the key thing and thing to keep in mind with Marlin is tailing your opponent or setting pressure so that we can hopefully try to kind of catch up with our opponent. Because if we're down like 20 points of life, that's a lot harder of a scenario basically than if our opponent is maybe giving us defensive resources like armor, or like we basically need to keep applying pressure to our opponent to hopefully kind of whittle them down from there. So tailing our opponent is basically very important. So I like to call this like the tailing phase, basically. So into matchups with a heavy armor sleeve, you'll often be very behind in kind of this early game scenario. And the important thing to note is that you want to kind of chew through your opponent's armor. So get them to use armor like their 2 temper equipment, get them to kind of throw reactions in front of you. And eventually, over the course of the game, you'll start to kind of chip through that armor, and then eventually your on hits will get significantly better. So the important thing to note, and kind of like I mentioned in the last section, is you can still win games where you're like 20 points life out of your opponent as long as you're kind of like chewing through their armor and getting over kind of like their defensive wall that they can have. So consistent pressure is kind of the key to keeping pace with your opponent and making sure that you eventually can kind of close the game out. All right, so now this is probably the most interesting segment of the presentation, or the segment that I think I'm the most proud of, and that is the shifting gears segment. So in a lot of decks in Flesh and Blood, we have different priorities for things we want to arsenal, right? So let's say like you're in Rhino, right? And maybe you have like a Blood Rush Bellow that you can't play this turn, but maybe you try to like arsenal it and set it up for next turn, right? So there's some very like clear things that you want to like arsenal in various classes. And a lot of times the cards actually stay the same. So like in like Brute, for instance, you always want to like arsenal your reds, or like in Ninja, you always want to arsenal like defense reaction, or maybe some like head jab or some starter or whatever. So a lot of the decks in the game don't actually have different priorities based on the game state that you are currently in, but Marlin is one of the decks where the priorities as you kind of play the game actually shift depending on the amount of resources you have and also kind of the stage of the game. So I'll kind of get into this now. So the first gear, or the kind of lowest gear on a car, is typically the one where the game is kind of the car is kind of the slowest, right? So I'm going to call this gear 1, where basically we're on a low amount of gold, so like 0 to 1 gold, kind of like the early state in the game. So to kind of establish like what your goal is as Marlin, you're hopefully trying to basically send a disruptive arrow every turn, ideally while also activating Hammerhead. Obviously, it doesn't always work out like that, but that's your kind of key goal as Marlin, is to kind of hopefully send an arrow basically every turn. So in the early stage of the game, my key focus is kind of keeping up early pressure in order to chew through our opponent's like armor and defenses and make my opponent's life harder in the late game when they can't block my arrows as easily, right? All right, so in this gear one stage, I wanted to kind of outline like what the priorities are, because the priorities are going to shift basically throughout the course of the game. So my number one priority, if we're trying to activate Hammerhead of Return, is basically using our gold and our small number of resources to hopefully try to keep sending arrows repeatedly, basically. So the way that we can do that is basically arsenal chaining. So like, let's say we send a shallow water out of arsenal from one turn, then we want to actually like arsenal maybe another arrow from our hand so that we hopefully have like a good next turn, basically. So in this initial stage of the game, my kind of priorities are basically any good arrows. Hopefully, if we draw like a red fin maybe against like an aggro deck, or we draw like a blue fin against a deck with a lot of blues, hopefully just to try to find our good arrows. But even like reload effects, like stuff like port side, codex, big game trophy shot, those are all really prime arsenal targets in the early game, because it lets us load and still like send damage and kind of keep pace with our opponent. And I even want to mention that in this like very early state of the game where we don't have a lot of gold, even arsenaling like bad arrows like Yellowfin or maybe like a Red Lure, it's still damage, right? So we want to basically make sure that we're kind of keeping pace with our opponent, even sending just any damage, even if it doesn't have like a disruptive on hit. And the things that are not really priorities at this stage are any real buff effects. So like Cheating Scoundrel, Premeditate, Golden Tip, Catch of the Day, like those aren't typically very good. They're typically like gold negative, right? Because we have to like crack gold after playing them to kind of like load another arrow in, right? So our buff effects are not a priority once we're in kind of like the early state of the game, but they'll get a lot better like later on. And also Codex is also not a priority if we don't have like a good target for it, or we don't have like any targets for it. Codex can also be quite bad in the early game. All right, so next we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and go to a medium amount of gold, so maybe like 2 to 3 gold. So once you get to this kind of point in the game, your priorities basically start shifting. So my arsenal priorities, whereas before like we didn't want to arsenal any buff effects, now that we have 2 to 3 gold, we can actually safely arsenal a buff effect and then try to line up like a buff on an arrow. So like our Cheating Scoundrels, Pre-Meds, Golden Tip, Catch of the Day, those all get a lot better. But now that we're at like 2 to 3 gold, basically the bad arrows become less of a priority. So if we're in a matchup where Red Lure is not relevant or Yellowfin's not relevant, then I'm not actually like looking to actually send bad arrows. I'd almost rather like not keep it as an arsenal, just so we can like free up our arsenal for Codex or some other kind of important thing, rather than arsenal like a Yellowfin or a Red Lure, right? So as we get more gold, basically our priorities start shifting to have basically more buff cards, more reload, and then the prime cards in our deck, like the good arrows, basically. And the goal, once we kind of get to this state, is that we want to actually start setting up more turns with overlap. So turns where we can like play multiple buffs on an arrow or play one buff on an arrow and start to get a little bit of that advantage that Marlyn is kind of known for, where we are able to stack up multiple buffs on an arrow and hopefully kind of explode our opponent for like 20 or something like that. That's kind of like the end goal, right? All right, now we're shifting to the third and final gear. So this is the fastest gear of our Marlyn car. And hopefully once we get to this point, we have like a decent pile of gold, so we can kind of do whatever we want. But our primary goal once we get to this point is to look for buffs, look for arrows, combine those two, and then hopefully line up like a huge arrow for like 20 or something like that. So once we get to this point, we can start being a little bit more liberal with our gold and kind of just like using gold, like cracking it just to try to draw extra damage, or kind of wasting it basically to kind of just like get further into our deck. So lots of options once you kind of get to this third gear, which doesn't always happen every game. But it's like a good phase to still kind of like know how to navigate. So we basically want to try to draw our buff cards. And I've also kind of like outlined our scenarios here that you can kind of look for. So common scenarios, I guess, are like cracking 3 gold, using 2 blues for getting +1 cards, so we can like maybe try to draw an extra buff, or even like cracking like 2 gold and using like Tunic for +1 card to kind of cheat that way. And also like the powerful scenarios that we kind of like also want to line up here are just digging for buffs when we have like 3 oak in hand. So oftentimes if I have like the option to, I'll maybe like save a 3 oak for arsenal and then try to like line it up on a hand with like buffs or cards we can block, so we can still kind of like defend and then maybe send some damage on the back end. All right, so to kind of outline the different gears on the Marlynn card, I've kind of actually outlined them here in basically a table. So the green section is basically anything that I consider to be like good or beneficial at that stage of the game, and the red section's like, I don't think this is like actually necessarily like that good of an arsenal, right? So in gear 1, basically when we're on a low amount of resources, our primary like arsenal targets are just any arrows basically that we can find, any reload effects, any like gold generation, and typically the buffs and codex depending on the part of the game we're on. I'm assuming that we're at like a very early part of the game where maybe codex is not live or doesn't have like a great target, tend to be like a little bit lower priority, right? But once we start to get to kind of like the mid game, right, where like we have maybe a little bit amount of gold and maybe codex is a little bit better, then we can kind of shift gears, I guess, to gear 2, where we don't have to like actually arsenal our bad arrows anymore, like yellowfin, redfin, etc. And then if you actually look on the third end, basically, once our car is functioning basically at full speed, we basically can try to look for just any buffs or any good arrows. So like our red arrows, any like relevant on hit arrows, any like codexes, and then any of our buff cards like premeditate, gold tip, big game trophy shot, catch of the day, etc. And those are our main targets. And you actually note here that I put that reload and gold is not as necessary when you have a high amount of gold. It's still like good to obviously like if you are given full tempo, like maybe keeping a C4 salvage is really good, right? But a lot of times, like once you have a high amount of gold, you don't actually need to make more gold, right? So the gold effects actually become a lot less relevant, basically, the kind of the further the game goes on, because you already have all the resources you kind of need, right? So this is kind of like a frame of reference for how my arsenal priorities basically will shift over the course of the game. So I'm not always looking to arsenal just a certain subset of cards. It very much depends on the game state. So like, is a yellowfin good to arsenal? Well, it very much depends on how much gold we have. Like if we are in the very beginning of the game and we're playing against like a Cinder who probably doesn't have a bunch of yellows in their deck, then I'm probably going to arsenal it just as like an arrow to send if I have no other choice, right? But if I'm throwing it in the mid game or some like later point in the game, there's no way I'm ever going to want to actively arsenal a yellowfin harpoon unless it's like a ponder or something else. Like I'd almost rather just like not even arsenal it off a ponder depending on the game state. But a lot of this is very dependent on like kind of the state of the game and also just like what your kind of goals for that particular turn are. Okay, so now that we've talked about changing gears, next I want to talk about drifting, which I think is everyone's favorite part of Initial D. It's when they basically turn the corner at a very fast, high speed and make up for their car's maybe performance disadvantage by gaining like a speed boost by quartering faster than your opponent, right? So I think Marlynn actually does a very similar thing. So I think drifting in this context, I'm going to basically loosely defined as setting up opportunities to take tempo. So Marlynn does this actually very well. Like once we kind of chew through that initial armor stage and we're sending kind of like these bigger harpoons, sending disruptive at our opponent is kind of like one of the ways that we can drift. Forcing our opponent to block with their like full hand to like fully steal tempo is also really powerful. Making gold or just setting up good arsenals or like getting card advantage over our opponent is like one of the ways that I think Marlynn can like also kind of drift. And then there's also this concept of like goading, so forcing your opponent to block with specific cards that they might otherwise want to keep, which is especially relevant in the warrior matchup. So like if we send a Kraken and our opponent is forced to block with their Edict of Steel or something, or like a very powerful non-attack action, then that's still really good for us, even if we're not maybe connecting with the harpoon, if we take the best card out of our opponent's hand. And then also other examples are maybe just like blocking 6 and 3 oaking. So we like block a little bit and just set up to take the tempo with like a 3 of a kind or something like that. So Marlynn actually has tons of ways to basically like kind of catch up and kind of send overwhelming damage at our opponent and try to hopefully kind of steal the lead. I think that's probably like one of the things that she kind of does best. So even if you kind of waffle in those initial stages of the game, as the game goes on, you have more and more opportunities to basically hopefully kind of take back some of that advantage, early advantage that your opponent has. And this isn't all necessarily exclusive to Marlynn. There are, I think, a lot of decks that maybe kind of fit this archetype. Like maybe Fang is actually like a decent example where Fang kind of starts out a little bit slow and then kind of like works his way up. There are a lot of decks that actually kind of probably follow a very similar thing, even like Florian maybe as an example. But Marlynn's not particularly unique in this case. I do just think that she has maybe like some of the best ways to kind of set up tempo. So I think she follows this pattern very strongly. All right, so once we've drifted and set up these opportunities to basically steal tempo, now that we have the tempo, keeping the lead is also very important. So once we get an advantage over our opponent, we want to make sure that we keep snowballing that advantage and hopefully trying to close out the game. So keeping lead also very important. Once we're ahead, we want to ideally try to stay ahead, and we need to use our resources wisely in order to kind of navigate the game to this point. This is especially relevant into like more defensive decks or like fatigue decks, where you basically need to manage your resources very cleanly throughout the course of the game, not just in the early game. But winning in the early game is especially important for Marlyn. So getting that initial advantage and kind of turning the corner is one of the ways that you can kind of snowball an advantage into the late game as well, right? So once we get into kind of those higher gears of the Marlyn car, we start to get like a decent gold stack, and it becomes very hard for Marlyn to brick once we get to like 2 to 3 gold, right? It's very hard to like actually brick on a hand that is 3 gold, because there's always like something you can do, whether that's just something like Gulpin Harpoon, or maybe trying to crack gold to try to look for specific arrows or something like that. It's very hard to actually brick on hands like that. So as long as we manage our gold well throughout the course of the game and try to snowball our advantage, Marlyn is typically very hard to kind of kill once she's already ahead, which is kind of what our goal for the deck is. All right, and if you think we weren't torturing this analogy quite enough, we also have this concept of gutter drifting. So I think in multiple races, Takumi basically kind of turns his wheel into the corner, which gives him like better gutter drifting speed or something like that. It's like a forbidden technique or whatever. But I think Marlyn also kind of has some forbidden techniques, and I kind of wanted to try to outline that these are kind of like rules to follow, but I think you should also try to break the rules as well. So gutter drifting is basically breaking the rules or trying to do something a little bit fancy to try to hopefully kind of get an advantage. So sometimes it's okay to actually not follow the rules that I initially set out in the presentation. So like sometimes it's okay to like go to 0 gold. Sometimes it's okay to not set up an arsenal, depending on if you know like what you're drawing into next. Sometimes it's okay to just like fully block with your hand, and sometimes it's okay to get a little bit greedy and just try to go for these bigger plays that may or may not work out depending on like what you draw. So you don't always have to follow kind of like the initial rules I outlined here, where you're trying to like always try to chain arsenals together in the early game or something like that. Like it's okay to break the rules as long as you kind of know what you're doing with the deck, right? And I think that kind of speaks to kind of being like a professional artist, almost kind of similar. So I got the little Pablo Picasso quote over here. But I think it's a very similar concept, is like know the rules, but then once you kind of know the rules, then you can kind of feel free to break them if there presents an opportunity itself to kind of like get some advantage, right? All right, so playing against a Hala, so this is a pretty good example of the warrior matchup. Let's go ahead and go second. I tried to treat Hala kind of a little bit as a tempo matchup, and going second actually lets us bring in Quiver, which is kind of nice. So let's go ahead and bring in our Hala board, which I think is just cutting the Krakens. I think I also cut like 1 Burdens in this matchup. But we'll go ahead and try it like this. All right, looks like our opponent is presenting a clean-ish 60, so this should be not necessarily like a fatigue matchup, should be more kind of closer to a bit of a mid-range matchup, hopefully. All right, they're just going to set up a flurry and pass. So the question is whether or not we actually want to use our Honing Hood here. I tend to, in this position, like not try to use Honing Hood because I think it's like fairly low value. Just because I try to treat Honing Hood as kind of a gold. So let's go ahead and hold the seafloor salvage here and just pitch the burdens. Try to hopefully draw into an arrow here. We do hit. That's very good. So the nice part about keeping the Honing Hood is that we actually kind of get to functionally kind of start the game with kind of a gold. In this case, actually, so this is one of the kind of opportunities where I'm going to showcase a gutter drift. This is very exciting. So normal practice says we should actually arsenal the C4 salvage as a higher priority than the gold tip, but because we actually have Honing Hood and we have like a pseudo gold, I'm actually going to try to maybe opt to arsenal the gold tip here instead. So I'm breaking the rules very slightly here, in the sense that you tend to not want to prioritize buffs when you don't have any meta gold, but Honing Hood we're kind of treating as almost a functional gold here, so we should hopefully be able to find an arrow next turn. All right, looks like they have all non-attacks in hand, so this is fine. We're basically still kind of trying to chew through their defenses here, try to hopefully play a little bit of catch-up. All right, Swordmaster's Path, and they're going to activate Hala to get 2 counters here. So unfortunately with this setup here, we can't realistically block out the Zenith Blade because they can threaten the Beckoning Steel on basically both halves of it. So the only thing that blocking would do here is basically we deny a counter on the first swing. But our hand's actually really good in terms of arsenal chaining. We have a Kraken that we can send next turn to try to hopefully chew through the armor, and then we can have a Bluefin as kind of follow-up for next turn. So we're going to hope that they don't have the Beck and Steel here, which looks like they might not. At least based on them not playing it on the first attack. All right, so we're kind of starting the game behind. Our opponent has like a ton of fridge that we still have to work through, but we kind of have tempo, at least at this point. We've traded a little bit of life for tempo, which is always very important. So let's go ahead and use our Honey Hood, which is kind of like our pseudo gold. So we're still kind of in that like gear 1 phase or whatever I call it, where basically we're very low on gold. We don't have a ton of like gold generation or anything kind of going for us. So we're kind of just trying to like keep pace with our opponent and hope to kind of try to match what they're doing until we kind of find the kind of good cards that we're looking for. Okay, looks like our opponent's going to give us 8 here, so they have a combination of Toad, Line, and Shelter. So the nice part is we've chewed through our opponent's defenses here. We've gotten 5 armor total, which is very, very good for us. So even though we didn't end up hitting with the Kraken, we've still kind of worked through the initial kind of phase where we have to kind of like beat out a little bit of their armor. So we're going to try to hopefully try to stabilize over the following turns. But it looks like our opponent's going to have a very good turn lined up here with a Sharp Incline plus Flurry. So very solid. So now I'm debating what I want to actually do with this hand. This might be a case scenario where we just try to send the Bluefin catch of the day, and then Trophy Shot kind of is going to be our arsenal priority. All right, they will also probably going to be able to set up 2 Vigor tokens here. So we're at a pretty bad kind of life disadvantage here, as we're kind of still trading blows with our opponent here. But we're hoping to kind of basically chew through the initial armor and then kind of get over their defenses at some point. So Bluefin should hopefully be a little bit annoying. That being said, that they do have the kind of 2 Vigors out, so they might actually care all that much if we take a blue here, given that they do have 2 resources pitched on their turn. It looks like we're going to get basically 3 cards out of our opponent here. We're also getting like a very premium card out of our opponent, the Beck and Steel. So this, we're almost getting to the point where we're drifting. Then you can maybe consider that a drift in the sense that we got a lot of really good value out of our opponent. When this next hand is excellent. So we can get to Trophy Shot here, potentially look to Codex. There's actually kind of like a green line where we can actually play out this salvage as well and just like make a gold pin. Question is whether or not we want to gamble off a blue. I think a blue or a yellow off the top both would work here. So we're still like very low kind of compared to our opponent here, but we're kind of hoping to catch up a little bit here. So this is going to be kind of probably our drift turn. So I'm going to actually take a very greedy line here since we're a little behind, and I want to actually maybe just try to utilize this gold to kind of enable our Trophy Shot. Unfortunately we hit the Battering Bolt here, which is a little unlucky. But this is fine. We'll try to make the best of kind of like a bad scenario here. So hopefully this Battering Bolt proves to be mildly annoying for our opponent. If we had a blue or a yellow there, we could actually like Codex Kraken, which would have been a lot higher value. But unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't line up like that. So we're definitely in still kind of like the initial stage of the game where we're trying to kind of find our footing here. But the nice part is at least our opponent doesn't have a Flurry set up just yet. So we should be able to maybe hopefully stabilize here. It's always the tricky part. It seems like they're going to sink, sure. I'm hoping that they actually sunk into a reaction because that would actually be very, very good for us. Okay, unfortunately they do not. They have a Bring Blade, Defensively Honed, and a CNC. So probably expecting to get CNCs next turn, but the nice part is CNC is not actually all that bad for us, especially if we can like kind of block 6 like here. But they do have Go again, so we're just going to basically take the 5 here, unfortunately. So getting very low, getting down to 13 is obviously quite scary. But now is kind of like the opportunity we're going to try to drift here. So we're going to go ahead and block 6 and then try to kind of pivot off of a 13 damage King Kraken, which should hopefully nab some cards from our opponent next turn. We basically worked through most of the armor at this point, so we do just have to play catch up on the life total itself, which is kind of important here. Hopefully the Frailty token will also be mildly annoying for our opponent here. So we're really hoping on this King Kraken to kind of connect here. This King Kraken connects, then we can start kind of pivoting into gear 2 or gear 1, I guess is what I maybe call, or no, is it gear 2? Maybe it's gear 2. But then we can, if we get a little bit of gold snowballing here, then we can kind of change gears, which it looks like our opponent's no blocking, so maybe we are actually entering that scenario. Okay, so we're going to go and take the Edict of Steel as probably the strongest card in their hand. That being said, they do have another one, so they could very well sharpen and get another here. But we ponder into Codex, which is fantastic. So now we can kind of start shifting our gears a little bit here. So we have the gold obviously set up. Okay, looks like they're going to sharpen, but the nice part is they do have the frailty here. And they're also pitching the provoke, so we don't have to actually play around that as well, which is fantastic. So we're going to be leaking a decent bit of damage here, but we should hopefully be able to stabilize with another 13 here. So we'll go ahead and turn over another Edict of Steel, get to 3 gold. So we're now kind of still in that like second gear stage where we can actually use a little bit of gold to our advantage here. Which we might end up doing given that we are, I think, fairly far behind this game. Like we're at 7 to their 13. The only issue is I also don't want to turn on their Balance of Justice is kind of ideal. So I think actually maybe now is not the turn to actually go for it here. Let's go ahead and just play our Codex and get our little bit of value here. I think I will even go for a hook here, just because we do need to kind of try to take a little bit of tempo back here. We have the gold. Now we just need to kind of work through and hopefully try to start connecting with our harpoons is the big thing here. All right, looks like they're going to give us the full 13 here, which unfortunately means we're going to lose our hook, but that's okay. We've bought some very precious tempo. And now we get to actually use that tempo to a pretty good effect here. So let's go and crack some gold here since we're already going to be turning on their Balance of Justice. There's not really a way to necessarily play around it. But we'll go ahead and play the gold tip. I think we're actually even going to play this tip the barkeep out just so that we have the option to maybe try shallow water here if we want to. It's a bit resource intensive, but we might get the opportunity to do it anyways here. This hand is a little unfortunate, but actually, could we do something interesting here? If we draw blue off the top, does that unlock this hand? No, we need multiple resources here, so I don't think, unfortunately, we can do anything cute here. But we will try to hold this gold the tip as kind of like our best card. And then we'll go ahead and send in the shallow water for 15 here. Hopefully try to turn a corner and maybe get a good arsenal out of them. If we can take a card from our opponent's hand and also take their arsenal, we're probably in okay shape, but we do need to draw pretty well next turn. Hopefully look to grab a 3-oak here. I do like to see a CNC block here as well. All right, so we put our opponent to 2, so we definitely kind of turned the corner at least a little bit in our favor. So now we just kind of have to survive through their next turn here. Hopefully see if we can maybe crack some gold and try to kind of drift, I guess, a little bit again. All right, so they're going to be coming in for 9 on the front and then an additional 6 on the back. So we're looking at basically 15 damage. We're at 7, so that basically means that we're going to have to block with basically our entire hand here. Or most of our hand. I think we're going to have to block with these 3 cards, if I'm not mistaken. So anyway, we can keep 2 cards if we block 7 here? No, right? So we have to give basically all these 3 no real choices here. So go ahead and turn over one of the yellows here. Or I guess one of our yellows is probably fine. So we're going to be functionally going to 1, but we do have a mountain of gold to kind of sit on. So we kind of turned a corner very late this game, but I think we do actually have enough kind of juice to work with here. So we'll go ahead and start by playing the golden tip. And then I think, so we do have 1 more 3 of the kind in the deck. But I think more likely than not, Goldfin is going to be enough here in the sense that we can kind of hope to send Goldfin and maybe just try to kill them with like 9 damage here. So we'll try to go for a baby Goldfin. The Atai also might end up being really annoying, especially if they do draw into their Diriax, which they still have Shelter and Sink Below. So both of those could actually mean we're taking like another card out of their hand here if they need to block. So this actually ends up being pretty good for us, I think. Right, so they sink below pitching another card, and then they take 1 damage, keep 1 card. So this is basically like the perfect opportunity. We've like fully turned the corner here. And basically the max damage that they can send on their next turn is basically 3. So this is actually fantastic for us. We have gold set up, so we never really got to like the crazy gold stack, which you can sometimes get to with the stack, obviously. But we've kind of just barely turned the corner here against, I think, what is a pretty good start from our opponent here as well. So now the question becomes, how do we make sure that we don't punt the game from here? Probably involves trying to keep the Kraken. Could consider like blocking like this is not crazy, so we have like 1 extra float for the trophy shot. So we're going to be sending 10, and then if our opponent is able to cover 10, that's fine because they're still not going to be able to send their Zenith Blade here. So I think we have successfully turned a corner here, which is great. We have just enough resources here to actually send the Kraken as well. A little bit of some mid 3-oaks this game, but that's okay. We could also consider making a Goldfin for Arsenal, but because our opponent's not going to be able to keep many cards from this, I don't think I'm going to try to go for that instead. So unless our opponent has some kind of reaction here, we win the game just barely. So that's kind of like a pretty good introduction for like how you can kind of drift with Marlynn, right? So we started the game very weak. Our opponent had a very, very good start in the sense that they had like multiple pretty good like edict turns. They were able to like double swing. They had a lot of offensive tools that were able to kind of like stop our initial kind of salvo of arrows. But once we actually like chewed through the armor, like got through the defenses and actually started connecting with the harpoons, then we were actually able to kind of get there. So this is a pretty good example of kind of like the archetype that I'm going to like kind of outline in the presentation. So we had the initial state of the game where we're pretty far behind. Our opponent has a ton of armor. Then we kind of stuck with our opponent. So we tried to use our hands as best as we can. We had some unfortunate RNG at some points, but we still just tried to make the most of our hands and try to just keep pace with our opponent to try to work through their armor and their kind of defensive tools. And then at various points in the game, we actually had some really cool pivot turns where we're actually able to block out a little bit of our opponent's stuff and then kind of actually send a lot of good tempo back their way. And then we used that tempo to just barely clutch the game out. So that was actually a lot closer than I feel like my Hala games normally are, maybe because their deck is like a little bit more aggressive. But just kind of goes to show that like warriors are still pretty doable, I think. I think on average, I'm actually like pretty favored in Hala, which is pretty cool. All right, so anyways, this was a little bit of a very tortured analogy to Initial D, but I hope that you actually found this presentation to be a little bit helpful. Now you can go Euro beat your opponents. Maybe Tegan will put in some music there that is revenue shared. But anyways, I hope that this presentation was actually helpful, and maybe that at least the gear shifting portion of the presentation was maybe something that was a little bit novel. So anyways, I wish you the best of luck on your Marlynn adventures, and good luck and stuff. So yeah, anyways, thank you all for watching. Hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all next time. And a special thank you to all the folks who decided it would be a good idea to give us $2 on Patreon. We really appreciate the support, but it's obviously never required.